Hi, and welcome to Time for Transition. Today we have Dennis Green from Southern New Hampshire University to talk to us about disability services at the college level. Dennis, go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this invitation, Heidi. I appreciate that. And I am grateful for anyone watching for this opportunity to share information about accessibility and accommodations in higher education. So again, my name is Dennis Green. I am the Director of Campus Accessibility at Southern New Hampshire University. Much of what I am going to talk about is fairly standard at all colleges and universities. So a lot of this will transfer quite nicely into whatever college or university you are looking into. I am going to advance to the next screen. There we go. So I'm going to talk at first about some of the laws and the definition of disability. I think these are relevant to discuss, since some of it will sound familiar to some of you, and some of it may be brand new for some of you. So there are laws protecting the civil rights of people with disabilities. So in K-12, you may have heard about IDEA, and that is Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is what many of the IEPs, if your child has an IEP, that would fall under this IDEA. And you can see it says K-12. That means it ends after 12th grade. So the IDEA law does not apply in higher ed. And that means when your child has an IEP, that the IEP no longer applies. Now we're going to talk about what that means, because it doesn't mean that services end, it means that they change. So another law is Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. Some of you might say, well, my child has a 504. This is the same law. The law does transfer to higher education. However, it's important to note that every institution has a right to ask for new documentation. So that 504 plan that your child may have had in high school doesn't directly transfer to higher education. Instead, which I'll talk about later, we'll talk about the process of submitting documentation and the intake, so that we can then look at accommodations for higher education, because they may be different. So the ADA, that is the Americans with Disabilities Act, that came about in 2008. That's another law that does apply to higher education. So the ADA defines disability as this. It says a disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So substantially limits, that's an important phrase, because we all have impairments that somehow limit us in major life activities. We've all had that at some point in our lives, but is there a substantial limitation that is substantially affecting our performance, our interaction, our participation in a major life activity? So the determination of whether a particular condition is a disability, I'm going to change this right on the spot. I'm going to say that's made by your healthcare provider, right, on a case-by-case basis. So my job really is to look at whether that disability substantially limits a major life activity, if that major life activity is something that your student engages in college or university. Switch to the next slide. So the process to access services in higher ed. And again, as I said right in the beginning, this process is going to be fairly uniform with whatever university or college you go to. So that very first step is disclosing to the Disability Services Office. And sometimes you'll notice that I use disability and accessibility interchangeably. That's because some of the offices will be named Disability Services Office. Some will have the word accessibility instead. You might even come into some that use the word accommodation rather than disability or accessibility, but they all do the same thing. Again, the first step is the disclosure to the Disability Services Office. Remember how I said there was that law IDEA, all right? In K to 12, it's the obligation of the school to identify people with disabilities and provide services. Once you go to higher education, it's a responsibility of the individual to disclose to the institution. So the institution doesn't seek out that person with a disability, identify them, and then provide services. We don't. It's not allowed. It is up to the student to disclose to our office so that we can then start that process to help serve them through accommodations. That second bullet says they provide documentation that meets the definition of a disability per ADA and substantiates the need for accommodations. So that's an important phrase, substantiates the need for accommodations, right? Again, you can have an impairment that limits a major life activity, but it really has to substantially limit, and there has to be, usually it has to do with the removal of a barrier of some sort. So when we look into accommodations, we talk about removing barriers, and there has to be that substantial limitation as defined by the ADA. So that third bullet, the student and the parents meet with an accommodation specialist prior to the beginning of the academic year for an intake. So that means that in addition to looking at documentation, we really want to meet the student and their parents and talk to them directly about those challenge areas, those strength areas, the strategies that they've employed in the past, prior accommodations that they had in high school. We want to take all of that into account. We don't want to just look at documentation and say, hey, we know what's best, right? We want to meet with the people who really, the student who's living with a disability and has used accommodations, or if they haven't used them yet, they are seeking them because they feel that they need a form of equal access. And we want to come up with the best solution for that student through accommodations. So the fourth bullet, the student meets with accommodation specialists initially, and then either on a scheduled basis or as needed. This is the student's choice. So no, I don't want to speak for any other college for this fourth bullet, right? I'm only going to speak for SNHU, and that is that when we meet with a new student, that is that first year student, first semester, we usually tell them, hey, we want to meet with you every other week. Now, we can't tell them they have to, right? The law doesn't allow us to do that. But we just say, we would really like to meet with you every other week because we feel it's very important to be supportive, to be there for you so that we can help you identify and utilize the various resources in college, like tutoring and coaching, things like that. And we want to be here to help you navigate that first semester because it's challenging. It's a new thing. It's a new transition, and it's going to be probably the most challenging semester because it is transitioning from home and from K to 12 to a higher ed in college, which is a different setup. Okay, accommodations versus modifications. This is important. Accommodations are appropriate academic adjustments used to provide equal access to a person with a disability. So you see equal access is underlined. That's important because the laws talk about equal access. ADA 504, they talk about equal access. So an accommodation is a means of equal access. It is that appropriate academic adjustment that is made so the student has equal access. The adjective reasonable is often used before the word accommodation, and you'll see this in the actual laws. Reasonable accommodation. That means that any accommodation requested, regardless of what it is, it doesn't mean that it's an automatic process that it's put in place. It does have to go through a filter of reasonableness, right? That determination. Does this make sense? Is this so extreme, or does it change the essential requirements of a course, which we're not allowed to do? So there is some there is some conversation and discussion about what reasonable means. Our office has great experience with that, as does any other disability services department. Sometimes you'll find that when you go from K to 12 to higher education, that you might look at that word reasonable accommodation differently, because there are more accommodations given in high school. And as a matter of fact, that brings us to the next bullet. Modifications are changes to what a student is taught or expected to do in school. For example, less homework or easier assignments. Now in K through 12, this is allowed. All right, so if somebody is on an IEP, they have an IEP, that is an individual education plan. The plan might actually have in it not only appropriate academic adjustments, it also might have modifications that help to provide a greater level of success for the student. Important delineation from college, because in college, that is separated. So the disability services offices focus solely on equal access through the use of accommodations. So no longer would there be modifications in college. So there's no easier assignments. There's no test that is, reduced in number of choices or essay length or anything like that. The good thing about that is it means every degree that students receive, those are the same degrees. They did the same amount of work. They had the same opportunities. As long as they were provided with equal access to the education, they had the same opportunity for success and failure. And that's a really important distinction. In higher education, you have the same opportunity for success or failure as long as you have that first step of equal access if you are a person with a disability approved for accommodations. I want to talk a little bit about the roles and responsibilities of the disability or accessibility centers. So again, I was just saying, so our job legally, we need to make sure that we ensure equal access. We don't want to ensure success. Now, this sounds strange. In some ways, it sounds like I'm saying that we don't want success. Of course, that's not true. Of course, we want every student to succeed. Our office, unlike all of the other departments in the university, has to make sure legally that our first step is ensuring equal access. Now, beyond that, the success aspect, that's where it falls into other support services that all students can use, things like coaching, right? Coaching is that aspect that looks at, help with study skills or organization or time management. There are things like tutoring that have to do with learning the content better, you're working with a tutor. Both those examples are things that all students can engage in. So it doesn't have to do with equal access, because there is equal access. All students can engage in those. So there's no accommodations needed. So the success part is separate. Also, what the student does with that. Does the student study every night? Do they put in the time that's required to be successful? Do they utilize these resources? And can they actually be successful with that content that's given to them and given to every other student? So the second bullet says evaluate documentation and intake information. So our responsibility is to look at the documentation, evaluate it, and meet with the student and the parent or parents and perform that intake, and really use that information with the student to come up with the appropriate accommodations. The third bullet says work with student on self-advocacy skills. So this is an important part of what we do. Now, there's not an accommodation for that. There's no accommodation that says we'll work on self-advocacy with a student or ensure self-advocacy or anything like that. This is an ethical responsibility for our office, right? We want to help that student grow. So let's say it's a 2-year program or a 4-year program, or the student is in school for 6 years. It doesn't matter. Over that period of time, we know that there is probably going to be growth, right? There's going to be cognitive growth and social growth and emotional growth. We want, and professional growth. We want all of those things. Entwined in all of those is that ability to advocate for oneself, to say, I need help, I don't understand, I disagree, all right, etc. All of those things, to advocate for oneself is very important. As we all know, everyone watching this video knows how important that is, to advocate for yourself in this world. So we try to help students learn that. We work with students and faculty to implement accommodations. So we send these accommodations out in a letter form. The student follows up and self-advocates for when they're going to use their accommodations. So it's not an automatic process that the faculty automatically puts those accommodations in place. It's that the student reaches out and says, hey, you got my accommodation letter, I got my accommodation letter. This is what I want to do with it. This is when I want to use it. This is how I want to use it. All right. Again, that gives them the opportunity to advocate for themselves. It also gives them choice, right? If we send that letter out and faculty automatically put accommodations in place, we've taken the choice away from the student. So we want to make sure that student has that choice and the opportunity to self-advocate and to succeed or fail based on their actions. It's very important. We also want to refer the student to other campus resources as needed. So I talked about those resources a little bit earlier. This is more specific. So the Learning Center for SNHU, that is where tutoring takes place. So we make sure the student knows about it. Now, they've heard it from all different sources, their advisor, through orientation, through different information, but we also will try to remind them of that. Hey, tutoring is off at the Learning Center. This is how you sign up. Here's the link. This is who you talk to, right? It's up to the student to follow up. Other resources include the Career Development Office, the Academic Advising Office, and the Counseling Center. So I had mentioned coaching earlier. So at SNHU, the academic advisor is also their coach. So it's advisor/coach, and the coach can work with them on things like organization, time management, study skills, note-taking skills, things like that. Our office also can work with students who are registered with our department. They can work with us as a coach if they prefer. So the roles and responsibilities of the students. So as I mentioned earlier, their first responsibility is to self-identify, right? We don't point anyone out. We know that most disabilities are invisible. So it's up to the student to disclose to us, and we have a process in place for that. And every school will have a process in place for that. Second bullet says discuss their needs relative to their disability, and that's where self-advocacy comes in. When we have that intake meeting, we ask the student a lot of questions. And sometimes family dynamics are always different, right? There's quite a range. Sometimes we'll have parents who really do most of the talking, all right? And that's because in K-12, that's part of that process. What you'll find in higher ed, some schools, including ours, including this department that I work in, we really try and change that focus. We bring it to the student again and again. Sometimes in those meetings, I will literally point out, I'll say to mom or dad, I'll say, hey, just to let you know, I'm going to direct my questions to this person, this student in front of me. Now you can interject, but I'd like you to give them that first opportunity to answer. All right, I'm trying to shift that focus from parent to student, because in higher education, the student is the one who will have that responsibility to advocate for themselves, to follow through on accommodations, to use those resources. So I'm trying to shift that focus right there, because we know usually mom or dad's not going to be in higher ed. They're going to be home. Even if the student commutes, they're still the one at school. So it's very important that we look into shifting that focus. So the third bullet says, assist in the process of determining what accommodations would be effective. So we've talked about this a couple times already. I don't just say, these are your accommodations that I've determined you need, right? That's not our job. Our job is to work with the student, to use the information they've given us, and to collaborate on accommodations that are substantiated and provide equal access, right? That's a group effort. That's the accommodation specialist and the student. And because at the intake, there can be a parent or parents there, parents are involved as well. The fourth bullet says, discuss accommodation forms with each professor. So the student follows up with those accommodation letters that we've emailed out to faculty, and they go to the faculty and they say, hey, this is what I want to do. This is when I want to use this. This is how I want to use this. They follow up. They initiate the use of those accommodations. Some are one-time requests, beginning of the semester. Some, it's each time. You know, if you have a testing accommodation, then you initiate the use of that testing accommodation for each test when you want. That's up to the student. Fifth bullet says, request accommodations in a timely manner, and accommodations are not retroactive. So request accommodations in a timely manner. So this is important. Let's go back to that test request again. So let's say somebody has testing accommodations where they have extended test time and they have reduced distraction testing, or they get to take their test in a separate room. All right, a timely manner is following the process, and that means at least 3 days in advance, at least 3 days in advance. The student puts in a request, a formal request for that test that's coming up 3 days later. Even better, 4 days, 5 days, right, or more. But 3 days is really that minimum, so that our office can then follow up with the faculty. The faculty can follow up with us and with the student. We can get the test to our office. We can make sure all the proctoring information is in place and that everything is set to go for that student. So the student, their responsibility is to make that request in a timely manner. So if somebody comes in, and we've had students come in an hour before a test and say, hey, I want to take my test here. Well, that's not a timely manner. We can't possibly reach out to the professor, get the test, get all the proctoring information, set up the testing room, get it all ready for this student in an hour. All right, so that's not timely. And that's also, when we go back to that term reasonable, it's not a reasonable accommodation if the timeliness is not taken into consideration. The parentheses there say accommodations are not retroactive. So this is important when we have somebody who says, I want to start the semester without accommodations. Right? It's very common that we have students who say, I want to do it without accommodations. I want to do it without accommodations. So they come and they try it September, October, and then they find out, hey, November 1st, they're in our office saying, I need my accommodations. I got to start this process. I got to get documentation in place, meet with you, do that intake, get the accommodations in place because the last 2 months were really not good. And they want to apply accommodations to what already happened. Well, the law doesn't allow for that. So what we say always to people is to go ahead, set up your accommodations the summer or spring even before you go to school. If you never use them, that's fine, that's your choice, but they're there, they're set up. And if you do need them, they're in place, you can make that request. It's very simple. It's just an email or dropping into the office saying, hey, I would like my accommodations, versus going through the whole process of submitting documentation, having it reviewed, having to go to an intake, etc., in the middle of the semester. So we always tell students, please set them up ahead of time, even if you never use them, it's to your benefit. The next bullet says, keep your accommodation specialist informed of concerns and be willing to ask for help. Be willing to ask for help. It's so important. I always go back to my example of there are no more lighthouse keepers, right? Meaning there are no jobs where you go and you sit at the base of the lighthouse and at night you go up and light it, and then in the morning you put it out and you work alone and you live alone in a house on an island. Doesn't happen, right? You work in groups now. We talk with people every day. all ask for help. I'm a director of a department. I ask for help every single day. Hey, could you help me do this? Could you tell me, I don't understand this process as well as I thought. Could you help me? That's normal. That's a normal part of the work environment for all of us to reach out to each other to ask for help. Sometimes students come in and they feel that that is a problem, that they want to do it all on their own. And I'm doing quotes right now, all on their own. And I tell them, nobody does it all on their own. That's not the way the work world works. It's not the way education works. So ask for help, ask for clarification, all right? Advocate for yourself, so important. The last bullet says, meet the same academic and disciplinary standards as all students. So same degree, same tests, same projects, same papers. You know, there's nothing watered down about a degree because somebody has accommodations, all right? That is different from what is allowed in K to 12. Higher education, if you have a degree in something, and it's the same degree as what your peers have in something, then it's the same work that you did, right? It's not watered down. Disciplinary standards, same thing. Now, this sometimes comes up because every once in a while, someone will say, because of a disability, I had this sort of behavior. And this can be a very challenging area. So there's a student code of conduct that says, this is what's appropriate in the classroom. This is what's allowed in the classroom, or this is what's allowed on campus or in the dorms. All students are held to the same code of conduct. However, if there is a behavior due to a disability, even though everyone's held to the same code of conduct, certainly a person can work with our office, they can work with community standards and share that information so that the information is out there. Now, the same standards still apply, right? But it could certainly help when people are talking about the education aspect of the outcome, the learning, what learning has taken place, what learning and education needs to occur for that person. So it is relevant, but it doesn't change the student code of conduct. All right, slide 7 out of 12. So these are the roles and responsibilities of the parents. So it's a little shorter list, but it says, discuss with your student the extent of information. You need to be assured that they are safe, happy, and productive. That's a really general, wide statement there, right? So it just means talk to your student, talk to your child, work with them, know that they are going to disclose to you, and sometimes very common what we see in our world, and not just in campus accessibility, but all students, is they tend to unload on parents. Like when things are going rough, they really give the parents a lot. They share everything with the parents, and parents go, oh my gosh, it's really rough right now for them. That's the dynamic. That seems to be a natural dynamic that we observe all the time. So parents, just be ready for that. I'm sure you've experienced that in K-12, that you might feel like, wow, they're really unloading on me. This is where discussion, processing, but not necessarily taking everything straight to heart and feeling the intensity of what they're feeling. It's your discretion as parents. We want to make sure people are safe, obviously. There are ways at all universities, if you have questions about your child's safety, of course, there are public safety departments. There are, in most modern universities and campuses, there are systems in place that kind of watch over students. However, if you ever feel that you know something that the college doesn't know and you are concerned for the safety of your child, reach out to the college, reach out to public safety. It's okay. All right. Public safety gets reach outs from parents all the time. The productive part, productivity is going to wax and wane. There's going to be times where your student might be very productive. Other times where they said they haven't done anything in 3 days, and you're wondering, oh my gosh, why is that? I hope they don't fail, right? that's where the discussion and listening comes in. Second one, remember that one of the goals for your student is growth in independence and self-advocacy, and discuss how you can be of help in this process. So self-advocacy and growth, it does allow, it does require your student to sometimes trip and fall. I don't mean that physically, obviously. I mean that sometimes there are things that happen, and for growth to take place, a student needs to try to advocate. They need to reach out for help. Again, you are a parent or a guardian where it is your discretion, right? We never want somebody to be unsafe. That's not what I'm talking about. Sometimes people will be a little uncomfortable. That's very different from being unsafe. Being uncomfortable sometimes results in some of the best growth that you can have, right? There have been very smart folks who learned tremendously from getting a C when they were straight A students, and somehow they got a C in a course, and they never forget it. And there were issues, things in that course where they actually grew in ways that they didn't expect. So just understand that you want to get your student, the whole system, us, you, your student, you all want to start here and in the end up here. I used the example before of like a investment graph. So if you have your 403 or 401k or whatever, and you're watching the market and it's going like this, and you know that it's like, oh my God, how am I ever going to retire? And you just hope that up here it's going to be higher than when you started down here. But it is going to go like this. That graph is probably not very dissimilar to student success in higher ed. That's what we see a lot of. We see those ups and downs. And we know that over time, there's a tendency for that student to grow. And by the time they graduate, there's a lot of growth in these areas. It's not pretty though. It's not always a pretty straight line that just goes right up like that. It really, there's going to be a lot of bumps. I can almost guarantee that for your student. Roles and responsibilities continued. So just as this is a FYI. So FERPA is a federal law that protects the privacy of the student. So I'm just going to read. No person from the university can discuss confidential information, which includes anything related to grades or disabilities, with parents without permission from the student. So your student, before they come to college, they will sign this FERPA. They will indicate on the FERPA what level of sharing that they are allowing. This sounds strange, right? Because up to this point, as a parent, you're the one who makes that decision. You will tell this high school, you know what's shared, and that is everything, right? That's your right. In higher ed, we now have a young adult who makes that decision. We know that the wellness center has nurses and counselors. So anyone in healthcare, or has probably heard the letters HIPAA, starts with a H. Now HIPAA is very strict, and HIPAA doesn't allow information out at all unless that patient allows it. FERPA is like that, however, not as strict as HIPAA. So here we are, the accessibility or disability services, we have some medical documentation, but we're not healthcare. So we work in academics and service, but we do more than that because we have this medical documentation and this knowledge of the student. So we actually have our own form, and that form allows the student to indicate who do they want us to be able to speak with. You know, so if a parent calls me about their child, I can only speak with them or share information if that student has signed our internal form. And I think many colleges have a similar system. So we're going to do a few common questions, the ones that we get the most often. First question, my child has an IEP in high school. How does that transfer into higher education? So as I mentioned before, an IEP only applies to K-12. The college's Accessibility Disability Services Office will require the neuropsychological or psychoeducational reports from the assessments used to set up the IEP. So if your child had those assessments to get an IEP, and they must have, we would be looking for those reports, those actual assessments to be sent to us. Between that documentation and an intake, appropriate accommodations are determined with the student. This is called the interactive process. So when I was talking about documentation and the intake with the student and talking with the parents, all of that combined is called the interactive process, right? It's never meant to be just us reading documentation. It has to be interactive. So we want those reports, and that initiates the interactive process. Second question, my child has a 504 in high school. How does that transfer into higher education? So the answer, although the 504 law still applies in college, each institution has a right to request new documentation and undergo the interactive process. Many accessibility disability services offices have forms for students to utilize with their healthcare providers. So for example, based on what I just read, at SNHU, we would say, okay, the 504 is a plan. It was used in K-12. That's great. We, however, have the right to request new documentation. So we have a form you give to your healthcare provider. It's going to indicate from the provider, what are those areas of substantial limitation? All right, that form comes back to us. You can also send the 504, but typically we don't go just by the 504 because it is a plan that was formed in K-12. So again, we usually would be requiring additional documentation unless that 504 has brand new information and it has all of the information that we're looking for from our internal form. Okay, so again, many accessibility disability services offices have forms for students to utilize with their healthcare providers. So just saying, well, I'll get a doctor's note. If you get a doctor's note, it probably is not going to have enough information on it. And that's why we give you the forms, why we have them available, because it leads the healthcare provider through the questions that we're looking for answers. Common question number 3, my child has specific needs for housing and/or dining. What do we have to do to ensure their needs are met? The answer, if a student has specific needs with housing and/or dining directly related to having a disability, they should reach out to the accessibility/disability center at their college and start the process for seeking accommodations in those areas. Frequent housing accommodation requests include singles, proximity to a bathroom, and first floor living, among others. These are all dependent, of course, upon what the substantial limitations are. Singles are fairly common requests to our department. Our job is to substantiate the need for equal access. I won't go into all of it because there's a lot when it comes into looking at housing accommodation requests. I will tell you, though, that this is very timely in nature. So this is not something that you wait till August or July for. You want to reach out to the university early on, right? Earlier than just the academic accommodations. That's my recommendation to you, because housing is usually decided earlier, right? If I get a request for academic accommodations in August, we can still go through that process and pretty much have the accommodations in place. But housing, if you wait till August to make a housing request for a single as an accommodation or whatever the accommodation is, housing selection could already be over. There may be no rooms left that you're looking for that have the accommodation needs. So I would urge you again to reach out to that disability accessibility center early on to find out timelines and forms that are needed for housing accommodation requests. Okay, I'm going to go to the last one. And I know I'm recording this, so I don't have an audience. I know, Heidi, you're right there. But these, questions, if somebody has a question, I would say, reach out to the college or university and ask, what is the disability center call? What is their contact information? And reach out to them and ask them questions. I can tell you with our process that we have inquiries. So an inquiry is just a family or a student who reaches out, even if they're not going to SNHU, they're maybe considering it, but they reach out and they say, hey, I'd like to ask some questions about accommodations, academic or housing, or what are the supports offered at the university. That's fine. And you have every right to do that. Reach out to the universities, ask questions. That's fine. And again, we call it an inquiry. A student is called a prospective student before they've decided on going somewhere. So you all know that most students are looking at a number of colleges and universities. It's fairly rare to say, I know exactly where I'm going and I'm only applying to one. It's much more common that students apply to several universities or several colleges and before they make that decision. So if a student is prospective, they haven't decided to go to a university or a college yet, but they're thinking about it. In that case, it's still an inquiry. You can still call up, you can still email, you can set up an appointment, and you can still ask those questions. When it comes to the actual documentation and the intake, we don't do those, we don't review the documentation fully until a student has decided they are in fact going to come to SNHU. And I think that's a fairly common process at other colleges and universities. We want to make sure the student's actually coming here before we read a 30-page document, right? That's kind of important time-wise, efficiency-wise. So once a student, they know they're coming, they have paid the deposit, they've been moved to student, they can share their information ahead of time with us, but it isn't until then that we then review the documentation. We reach out to the student, say, hey, sometime, you know, in May, June, July, or August, please set up an intake appointment with us. We'll meet with you and whoever you would like to have present, a parent or guardian, and we'll figure out what are the accommodations that can be substantiated. All right, so that's our process. Other questions? So I can tell you, I talked about support services. So sometimes people will ask, is tutoring an accommodation? And as I mentioned earlier, because tutoring is available to all students, it's not an accommodation, right? Accommodation is a legal form of equal access, while tutoring is available to all students already. So no accommodation is needed. There's no accommodation for an increase in tutoring. So if somebody says, I need tutoring 5 days a week and they only allow me 3 days a week, I need an accommodation for more tutoring. So as a support service, tutoring falls under that part that is success aspect of university. Remember how I was saying there's success and access? So my department is focused now solely on access to make sure that we meet that legal obligation and the ethical obligations of providing equal access to your student. Tutoring falls into that next level, and that is success. You know, the student who goes to tutoring is much more likely to be successful. They're using the resources. The student who goes to see their coach and works on time management skills in organization is more likely to be successful, right? Well, all of those services are available to all students. So they're not a form of equal access through accommodations. So, you know, again, encourage everybody reach out to your college, university, those disability services departments if you have questions. I encourage people to disclose so that you're not waiting till the middle of November or October when things are really challenging for you. Disclose early on, even if you never use accommodations, right? They don't cost money, right? Nobody's ever charging for accommodations. It's a form of equal access. It's your right to use them, and it's really in your best interest to go through the process, have them in place. Okay, and I want to thank all of you listening to this for taking the time. and wish you all the best of luck when it comes to working with your kids, your young adults, and navigating that pathway into higher education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.